The first time Cedar Ridge, Kansas, ever laid eyes on Silas Townsend, he was walking down the middle of Main Street with dust on his boots, a borrowed hat on his head, and not one single coin in his pocket. And by the time the sun set on that same day, half the town swore he would either be run out on a rail or shot dead before supper. It was the spring of 1878, and the town had grown fat and nervous on cattle money, the kind of place where the railroad had arrived just in time to save it from becoming another forgotten crossing on the Kishom Trail. Herds came through every few weeks, trail hands spent their pay in the saloons, and the ranchers who had staked their lives on the grass and the rain came into town to borrow against next year's calves. All of that borrowing, all of that hope, ran through one building on the corner of Main and 2nd Street, a squat brick structure with gold letters on the window that read Bailey Trust Bank. And it was inside that building that Kate Bailey stood behind the counter, 26 years old, her father 8 months dead, and her hands trembling only a little as she counted out the last of the bank's silver for a rancher who did not know it was the last. She had inherited the bank the way some women inherited grief, all at once and without asking for it. Thomas Bailey had built the place with his own hands in 1867, back when Cedar Ridge was nothing more than a supply stop and a dream, and he had run it honestly for 11 years before his heart gave out on a Tuesday morning while he was totaling the week's deposits. Kate had been the one to find him, slumped over his ledger, the pen still in his hand, and she had been the one to bury him 3 days later while the town watched to see what would happen to his bank now that a woman was left holding the deed. What happened, mostly, was Elias Grimshaw. Grimshaw owned the other bank in town, the Cattlemen's Exchange, 2 blocks down and twice as grand, with marble steps and a brass railing that he had shipped in from Kansas City at considerable expense. He had wanted Thomas Bailey's bank for years, not because he needed it, but because he could not abide competition, and because owning every dollar that moved through Cedar Ridge appealed to something hungry in him that had never once been satisfied. With Thomas gone and his daughter alone at the helm, Grimshaw saw his opportunity clear as daylight, and he set about pressing it the way a man presses a bruise, gently at first, then harder, watching for the wince. He had sent his son Cornelius around twice already, with proposals of marriage dressed up as neighborly concern, and twice Kate had turned him away with a politeness that was costing her more each time. She had also discovered, quietly in the weeks since her father's death, that certain loan papers in the bank's files did not match the numbers in her father's private ledger, that certain ranchers who swore they owed less were somehow shown to owe more, and that the discrepancies always seemed to point toward foreclosures that would benefit, in some roundabout way, land that Elias Grimshaw already had his eye on. She could not prove it. She barely dared to think it. But she felt it the way a person feels a storm coming before the sky changes color, and she had no one to help her carry the weight of that feeling, because her father's head clerk, a narrow, careful man named Otis Whitcomb, was the one who kept those very ledgers, and something in her did not trust him enough to ask. That was the bank Silas Townsend walked into on a Thursday morning in April, and he walked into it because he had nothing left and nowhere else to go. He had come up from Texas with a small herd of his own, 3 years of saved wages and borrowed courage put into 200 head of longhorn cattle, driving them north along the very last stretches of the old trail toward the railhead, dreaming the way every cowboy dreamed of turning cattle into cash and cash into land of his own. A flash flood outside of Caldwell had taken half his herd in a single night, and rustlers, opportunistic and merciless, had taken the rest 3 days later while he slept sick with fever in a lined shack, too weak to stand watch. He had arrived in Cedar Ridge with a horse that was not much better off than he was, a Colt revolver with 2 bullets left in it, and a set of hands that knew how to work a rope, and though almost nobody in that town would have guessed it, knew how to work a column of figures faster and cleaner than most men who had gone to school for it. Before the war, before Texas, before any of it, Silas Townsend had been a bookkeeper's son in Georgia, and his father had taught him numbers the way other fathers taught their sons to shoot or to plow, patiently, and with love, right up until the war came and took the family's land out from under them through a foreclosure that Silas had watched happen with his own eyes when he was 16 years old. A banker in a fine coat standing on their porch reading a legal notice, while his mother wept into her apron. He had never forgotten the particular shame of watching someone in a clean collar take from his family everything they had built, and he had never forgotten, either, that the same numbers that had been used to ruin them were, in honest hands, nothing more than the truth laid out plain. He had gone to war at 17 because there was nothing left not to fight for, and he had come home to Texas because there was nothing left to go back to. And now, at 31, dust-covered and broke on the streets of a Kansas cattle town, he found himself standing outside a bank with gold letters on the window, staring at his own reflection, wondering if he had anything left in him at all. He went in anyway. A man with nothing has very little to lose by asking. The bell above the door rang thin and bright, and Kate Bailey looked up from behind the counter to see a tall man in a threadbare coat, hat in his hands out of respect, standing just inside the doorway like he was not entirely sure he had a right to be there. His eyes were a clear gray, tired but alert, and there was a stillness to him that struck her immediately, the stillness of a man who had learned to conserve every ounce of himself because he did not know when he would need it. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "I am looking for work if there is any to be had. I do not have money to open an account, and I will not pretend otherwise, but I can read a ledger clean and I can add a column of figures faster than most men can find their spectacles, and I would be obliged if you would let me prove it." Otis Whitcomb, from his desk near the vault, gave a short, dry laugh. "This is a bank, mister, not a relief house. We are not in the business of charity." "I did not ask for charity," Silas said, without heat, without looking away from Kate. "I asked for work." Kate studied him a long moment. She had turned away 3 drifters that same month who had come in asking for loans they could never repay, men with big talk and empty saddlebags, and there was a part of her, worn thin by grief and worry, that wanted to send this one out the door as easily as the others. But there was something in the plainness of his request that caught at her, some quality of a man asking honestly for the one thing he believed he was actually worth, instead of asking for more than he had earned. "What is your name?" she asked. "Silas Townsend, ma'am, and you can read a ledger." "I can, and I can tell you, if you will permit me, that the figure on the paper in that gentleman's hand does not match the sum he is presently adding, on account of the 7 in the second column being written over what looks to have once been a 2. Silas said it evenly, without accusation, simply an observation offered the way a man might point out that it looked like rain. Otis Whitcomb's face went the color of old paper. "That is an outrageous thing to say to a man you have known all of 30 seconds. "It is not an accusation, sir, only an arithmetic," Silas said. "I would be glad to be wrong." Kate crossed to Whitcomb's desk and looked down at the ledger herself, and there, plain as anything once she knew to look for it, was a 7 inked over the ghost of a 2, the alteration nearly invisible unless a person already suspected something was there to find. Her stomach dropped. She had been searching for exactly this kind of thing for weeks and had found nothing, and a stranger off the street had spotted it standing in the doorway with his hat still in his hands. She did not let her face show what she was thinking. She only said, "Mr. Whitcomb, would you be so good as to step out and check on the delivery from the freight office? I believe it was due this morning." Whitcomb hesitated, glanced at Silas with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite fear but sat somewhere uneasily between the two, and then rose and left, the bell over the door ringing again in his wake. Kate turned back to Silas. "Mr. Townsend, I am going to ask you a question, and I would like an honest answer, because I have had enough of men who tell me what they think I want to hear. I do not know how to be any other way, ma'am. It has cost me plenty. Did you truly see that error just now, standing where you were standing, Or did you already know something about this bank before you walked in? I saw it just now, Silas said. I have spent a good part of my life around numbers, and a man's handwriting changes when he is nervous about what he is writing, even if he thinks it does not. I noticed the same thing about you, ma'am, if you will forgive my saying so. You have been holding your breath in this room since before I walked in, like you are waiting for something bad to happen. Kate felt heat rise in her face, less from embarrassment than from the strange relief of being seen so plainly by a stranger. That is a bold thing to say to a woman who has not yet decided whether to hire you. It is the only kind of thing I know how to say, ma'am. I told you I did not have money. I did not tell you I did not have opinions. Something in her wanted to smile, and she did not let herself, not yet, not while there was so much unresolved sitting heavy on her chest. I cannot pay much, she said instead. This bank is not what it was when my father was alive, and I suspect you have already guessed some of why. I have, Silas said. I would be glad to help you find the rest of it, for whatever wage you can spare, and if you cannot spare a wage, I will work for a bed in the stable and a meal a day until you can. That is not much of a bargain for you. Ma'am, 3 days ago I did not have a horse worth riding or a bullet worth firing. A bed and a meal is considerably more than I had. I am not looking to take anything from you. I am looking for a reason to be useful again. Kate looked at him a long moment, weighing the risk of trusting a man she had known for 5 minutes against the greater risk of facing Elias Grimshaw and whatever was hidden in her own ledgers entirely alone. In the end, it was not really a contest at all. There is a room above the stable, she said. It is not much, but it is dry. You will start tomorrow, Mr. Townsend, and you will start by telling me everything you noticed in that ledger, and you will not breathe a word of any of it to Otis Whitcomb or to anyone else in this town. You have my word, ma'am. Kate, she said before she quite decided to. You may call me Kate if we are to be conspirators. Something warmed in his gray eyes, the first real light she had seen there since he walked through the door. Kate, he said, and it did not sound like he was merely repeating a name. It sounded like he was setting it carefully somewhere he intended to keep it. The weeks that followed were not the stuff of easy romance, not at first. They were long hours of candlelight after the bank closed. Kate and Silas hunched over her father's private ledger and the bank's official books, cross-referencing entries, finding a pattern emerging slowly out of the fog of small alterations. A loan marked paid that had never been paid. A rancher's debt inflated by $100 here, $200 there, small enough that no single rancher would think to dispute it, large enough across dozens of accounts that it added up to a sum that could ruin the bank outright if called due all at once, or could be used to justify seizing land from ranchers who suddenly, on paper, owed far more than they believed they did. He is building a case, Silas said one night, rubbing his eyes in the lamplight, the two of them alone in the bank long after the town had gone quiet outside. Whitcomb is doing this on someone's instruction, and I would wager everything I do not have that the someone is Grimshaw. He wants your bank to look weak on paper, weak enough that when he offers to buy you out or forecloses on you outright, the town will think it a mercy instead of a theft. Kate sat back in her chair, exhaustion pulling at the corners of her eyes. My father spent 11 years building trust in this town, one honest transaction at a time. It took Otis Whitcomb a fraction of that to start tearing it down. It is easier to tear down than to build, Silas said quietly. I learned that a long time ago, watching a banker in a clean coat take my family's farm with nothing but a piece of paper and a signature nobody asked my father to properly understand. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to stand on the other side of that kind of moment, I would stand for the person losing something, not the person taking it. Kate looked at him across the lamplight, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The silence between them, thick with something that had nothing to do with ledgers or fraud or Elias Grimshaw. She saw, not for the first time, the particular gentleness that sat underneath his tiredness, The care he took in stacking the papers evenly before he set them down, the way he always made certain her cup of coffee was closer to her hand than his own. "You could have told Grimshaw what you found," she said. "He would have paid you far more than I ever will for information like this." "I know it," Silas said. "Why didn't you?" He considered the question longer than she expected, as though he wanted to give her the true answer, and not simply the easy one. "Because the day I walked into your bank, Kate, you did not ask me who my family was or what I owned or what I could offer you beyond my word. You looked at a man with empty pockets and you gave him a chance to be worth something. I have been given very little in my life without a price attached to it. I am not in a hurry to sell the one thing that was given to me plain." Kate's throat tightened, and she looked down at the ledger to keep him from seeing exactly how much those words had moved her. "That is either the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a year," she said, "or the most practiced line I have ever heard from a man trying to get himself invited to stay longer than a room above the stable." Silas laughed, low and real, the first proper laugh she had heard from him, and it changed his whole face, made him look younger, less burdened. "I promise you, ma'am, if I were trying to charm my way into anything, I would have picked a subject with considerably more romance to it than 7 altered ledger entries. What would you have picked instead?" "I have not gotten that far in my thinking," he admitted. "I have been rather occupied with cattle loss, ledger fraud, and trying not to get myself run out of a town I have only lived in for 3 weeks. "Well," Kate said, and there was a lightness in her voice that had not been there in months, "when you do get that far in your thinking, Mr. Townsend, I would be curious to hear the subject." "I will let you know, Miss Bailey," he said, and the way he said her name, formal and warm all at once, told her plainly enough that he already had an idea, even if he was not yet ready to say it aloud. It was in early June, with the summer heat beginning to press down on Cedar Ridge, and the cattle drives thickening the streets with dust and noise, that Elias Grimshaw came calling in person for the first time since Silas had arrived, and he did not come alone. He brought his son Cornelius, a soft-handed young man of 24 who had never worked a day of honest labor in his life, and he brought with him an air of a man who believed the outcome of the conversation was already settled before it began. He found Kate at the counter and Silas at the back desk, and his eyes flicked between them with a calculation so plain it was almost insulting. "Miss Bailey," Grimshaw said, removing his hat with theatrical courtesy, "I have come with a proposal, and I would ask that you hear it through before you refuse it, as I believe you are inclined to do with most things I offer." "I will always hear a proposal, Mr. Grimshaw," Kate said. "Whether I accept it is another matter entirely." "Word has reached me," Grimshaw said, "that this bank's accounts are not what they once were. That certain loans have gone unpaid. That certain ranchers are struggling under debts your late father extended too generously. I am prepared to purchase this bank outright at a fair price and to absorb its obligations into the cattlemen's exchange, sparing you the burden of a failing institution that no woman, however capable, should be asked to carry alone." "And what becomes of the ranchers who owe on those loans?" Kate asked. "They will be treated fairly," Grimshaw said, in a tone that made the word fairly sound like something with sharp edges hidden inside it. "I have heard that promise before," Kate said. "From men whose idea of fairness left widows without their homes." Grimshaw's smile thinned. "There is another way to settle this, Miss Bailey, one that might spare us both the unpleasantness of a forced sale. My son Cornelius has expressed, on more than one occasion, a sincere admiration for you. A marriage between our families would join our 2 institutions naturally, without scandal, without any need for lawyers or notices in the paper. Your father's name would be preserved. Your position would be secure." Cornelius, standing beside his father, offered Kate a smile that did not reach his eyes, a smile that had clearly been coached rather than felt. "My position," Kate said, "is secure precisely because I intend to keep running my father's bank myself, Mr. Grimshaw, not because I intend to hand it to your family in exchange for a wedding ring. You may not have the luxury of that choice much longer," Grimshaw said, his patience thinning at last. "I have it on good authority that this bank is carrying debts it cannot cover. If word gets out among your depositors, you will face a run on this institution that no amount of pride will survive. I would rather see this handled quietly for your sake." "For my sake," Kate repeated. "Mr. Grimshaw, I do not believe you have ever once done anything for my sake in your life. I believe you have done everything always for your own." Silas had gone still at his desk during this whole exchange, watching, listening, his jaw tight, and it was only when Cornelius, emboldened by his father's aggression, let his gaze slide over towards Silas with a sneer and said, "And who exactly is this, sitting at a clerk's desk like he belongs there?" that Silas finally rose. "Silas Townsend," he said, stepping forward, his voice even but carrying a weight that filled the room. "I keep this bank's books now, Mr. Grimshaw, and I have found some interesting things in them these past weeks. 7-column entries with numbers written over other numbers. Loans marked paid that show no record of payment anywhere in the actual cash drawer. Debts that have grown on paper without any corresponding loan being extended." The silence that followed was absolute. Grimshaw's face did not change, not obviously, but something behind his eyes went very cold and very careful. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Townsend, to make against a respected businessman of this town." "I have not accused anyone of anything, sir. I have only described what is written in the ledger, in Otis Whitcomb's own hand. Whether that connects to you is a question for a judge, not for me, standing here in a bank on a Tuesday afternoon." "You would be wise," Grimshaw said, his voice dropping low, "to remember that you are a man of no standing in this town, Mr. Townsend, a drifter with no land, no family here, no reputation to protect. Men like that have a way of disappearing from towns like this without anyone asking too many questions." "I have been threatened by better men than you, sir, and I am still standing," Silas said, quiet and unmoved. "I would think carefully before you make that kind of threat again, especially in front of a witness." Grimshaw looked at Kate, then at Silas, and something in his expression shifted from confidence to a wary, calculating anger. He set his hat back upon his head with exaggerated care. "You have 1 month, Miss Bailey," he said, "before I bring this matter before the county bank examiner myself, and let him decide whether your father's bank is fit to remain open. I would suggest you use that month wisely." He turned and walked out, Cornelius trailing after him, casting one last resentful look at Silas before the door swung shut behind them, and the bell rang its thin, bright note into the sudden quiet. Kate sank onto the stool behind the counter, her hands shaking now in a way she no longer bothered to hide. "A month," she said. "He will bring in a bank examiner who is likely already in his pocket, and he will use the very fraud his own man planted to prove that my father's bank cannot be trusted, and there is nothing in any law book that will stop him, because the evidence on its face looks like my father's negligence, not Whitcomb's theft." Silas crossed to her, crouched so he was eye level with her where she sat, and took her hands in his, steadying their trembling with the calm, sure warmth of his own. "Then we have 1 month to prove whose negligence it truly is," he said. "I did not survive a war and 2 robberies and a flood just to watch a man like Grimshaw take the one good thing this town has left standing. We will find where Whitcomb hid the truth, Kate. Men like him always keep a record somewhere, because men who cheat are usually also men who are afraid of being cheated themselves. He will have proof of what he did, if only to protect himself from Grimshaw someday deciding he is no longer useful." Kate looked down at their joined hands, then up into his face, searching it. "Why do you care this much, Silas? You could ride out of this town tonight and never look back, and none of this would touch you again." "I could," Silas admitted. "But I would be riding away from the first place in a long while that has felt like it might be worth staying for." He hesitated, then added, softer, "and from the first person in a long while who has made me want to stay." Kate's breath caught. The lamplight flickered low between them, throwing gold across the planes of his face, and for a moment the danger of Grimshaw and the fraud and the whole uncertain future of the bank fell away, and there was only the nearness of him, the warmth of his hands around hers, the steady, searching look in his gray eyes. "Silas," she began, unsure what she meant to say next. "I know," he said gently. "It is not the time. There is too much at stake, and I would not have you feel pressed into anything on top of everything else Grimshaw is pressing upon you. But I wanted you to know it, plainly, the way you gave me a chance plainly that first day. I have come to care for you, Kate Bailey, more than I have cared for anyone or anything in a good long while. And whatever happens with this bank, with Grimshaw, with all of it, that is true, and it will stay true." Kate reached up without quite deciding to and touched his jaw, feeling the roughness of a day's stubble under her fingers. "I have come to care for you too," she whispered. "More than I expected to, and faster than I know what to do with." They did not kiss that night. It was not the moment for it, both of them too aware of the shadow hanging over the bank, over the town, over the coming month. But something had been said aloud that could not be unsaid, and it settled between them like a promise waiting for its proper hour. Over the following days, Silas and Kate turned the bank's back room into a quiet battlefield, searching every drawer, every filing box, every loose paper Otis Whitcomb had ever touched. They found nothing at first, and Kate began to despair that Whitcomb had been too careful, that Grimshaw's month would run out before they found a single thread to pull. It was Silas who finally thought to ask a question no one else had thought to ask. "Where does Whitcomb keep his own money, Kate? A man committing fraud on this scale does not do it for nothing. He is either being paid or he is skimming for himself. Either way, that money has to go somewhere." They discovered, through careful and quiet inquiry at the general store and the telegraph office, that Otis Whitcomb had, over the past year, sent no fewer than 6 separate money orders to an address in Wichita, always in amounts just under $100, small enough not to attract attention on their own, but adding up, across 6 transfers, to a sum that no bank clerk's honest wage could explain. Silas rode to Wichita himself, 4 days there and 4 days back, using the very last of his own saved wages to make the trip, and returned with a name pulled from the receiving office records. The address belonged to a boarding house owned, discreetly, through a third party, by none other than Elias Grimshaw. It was not, by itself, enough to hang a man in a court of law, but it was enough, laid alongside the altered ledgers, to paint a picture that any honest judge could follow, and more importantly, it was enough to make Otis Whitcomb afraid. Kate confronted him herself, on a quiet evening after the bank had closed, with Silas standing nearby, not speaking, simply present, a solid and steady witness to whatever might unfold. "Mr. Whitcomb," Kate said, laying the Wichita receipts on the desk in front of him, "I know where this money has been going, and I know who has been paying you to alter my father's ledgers. I am giving you one chance, right now, to tell me the whole truth, and if you do, I will speak on your behalf when this comes before the county examiner. If you do not, I will let the law decide what to do with a man who has spent a year robbing grieving ranchers on behalf of a rival banker." Whitcomb's carefully composed face crumbled all at once, the fear that had clearly been sitting beneath his surface for months finally breaking through. "He came to me 2 days after your father's funeral," Whitcomb said, his voice thin and shaking. "Told me my job would be safer with him than with a woman who did not know the business, that all I had to do was make a few small adjustments, nothing anyone would ever notice, and I would be paid well for my trouble. I told myself it was harmless at first. A number here, a number there. I did not think it would grow into what it became. I did not think he meant to take the whole bank." "But you kept doing it," Kate said, "long after you understood exactly what it meant." "I was afraid of him," Whitcomb admitted. "I am still afraid of him. He is not a man who forgives disloyalty easily, Miss Bailey, and I have a wife and 2 children in this town who would suffer if he decided to make an example of me." "Then help us stop him," Silas said, speaking for the first time. "Write it all down. Every instruction he gave you, every ledger you altered, every dollar he paid you. Sign it, and we will see that you are protected, as much as it is in our power to protect anyone from a man like Grimshaw. It is the only way you come out of this with anything left of your name." Whitcomb sat for a long moment, his hands trembling on the desk, and then at last he nodded and reached for a fresh sheet of paper. It took him most of the night to write it all out, a full confession detailing every altered entry, every instruction from Grimshaw, every payment received. And by the time the first gray light of dawn touched the windows of the bank, Kate Bailey held in her hands a document that could unmake Elias Grimshaw's careful scheme entirely, provided they could get it in front of the county examiner before Grimshaw found a way to silence it, or silence them. Word travels fast in a small town, and it traveled faster still when the person carrying it was afraid. By that same afternoon, Grimshaw had learned, through some corner of his network that Kate and Silas had not accounted for, that Whitcomb had turned against him, and he did not intend to wait quietly for the county examiner to arrive on schedule the following week. He sent men that night, 3 of them, rough hired hands who worked his cattle when they were not doing darker errands, with instructions to break into the Bailey Trust Bank, retrieve the confession and the altered ledgers, and burn whatever else looked like evidence, and if anyone got in the way, to make certain they regretted it. Silas had taken, in recent nights, to sleeping in the back room of the bank rather than the stable, uneasy since the confrontation with Grimshaw about leaving the place unwatched, and it was the soft, deliberate sound of the back door lock being worked that woke him a little after midnight. He rose without a sound, took up the old colt that had carried him through Texas and the war before it, and moved through the darkened bank toward the front room, where he could see, through the front window, a shape passing across the street that did not belong to anyone with honest business at that hour. He reached Kate's small apartment above the bank, where she had continued to live since her father's death, and woke her with a hand on her shoulder and a whispered word, and together they crept back down to the main floor, Kate clutching her father's old shotgun, kept loaded behind the counter since the week after the funeral, though she had never once fired it at another human being in her life. The back door gave way with a splintering crack, and 2 men came through it fast, expecting an empty building, and instead found Silas standing square in the doorway to the vault room, his Colt leveled, steady as a fence post. "That is far enough," Silas said. "Whatever Grimshaw is paying you, it is not worth what happens next if you take one more step." One of the men, a broad-shouldered fellow with a scar through his eyebrow, laughed low and mean. "There is 2 of us and 1 of you, cowboy. I do not think you are in much of a position to be making threats." "There is 2 of you and 2 of us," Kate said, stepping into view beside Silas, the shotgun leveled with more steadiness than she felt inside her chest, her heart hammering so hard she was certain the men could hear it. "And I have buried 1 man I loved already this year. I am not inclined to bury this bank on top of him." The 3rd man, who had stayed near the back door as lookout, called out low, "Riders coming, Tom. We need to move." And in the scramble of confusion and hesitation that followed, the scarred man lunged for Silas rather than for the door, perhaps hoping to end the standoff quickly before the town could be roused. What happened next happened fast, the way real danger always happens fast, faster than fear has time to properly settle before it is already over. Silas sidestepped the lunge, brought the barrel of his Colt down hard against the man's temple rather than firing it, dropping him stunned to the floor rather than dead. A choice made in half a heartbeat, but one that would matter greatly to how the following days unfolded. The 2nd man, seeing his companion fall, bolted for the back door, and Kate, her hands shaking so badly the shotgun wavered, nonetheless held her ground and did not fire, because the man was running away and there was no cause left to shoot, only cause to let him go. The riders that the lookout had heard turned out to be nothing more sinister than the town's night patrolman, an aging former soldier named Deputy Harmon, making his usual late rounds, drawn by the sound of splintering wood. Between Harmon's arrival and the scarred man groaning awake on the bank floor with a considerable headache, and considerably less loyalty to Elias Grimshaw than he had possessed a few minutes earlier, Cedar Ridge had, by morning, both a prisoner and a witness willing, under the promise of a lighter sentence, to swear before any judge that Elias Grimshaw himself had paid him to break into the Bailey Trust Bank and destroy evidence of fraud. Kate sat afterward on the front step of the bank, wrapped in a shawl against the pre-dawn chill, her whole body still trembling with the aftermath of fear, and Silas sat down beside her, close enough that his shoulder pressed against hers, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, simply breathing together in the gray hush before sunrise. "You could have been killed," Kate finally said, her voice small in a way it rarely was. "So could you," Silas said. "You stood there with that shotgun steadier than half the men I served with in the war." "I was not steady. I was terrified." "Terrified and steady are not opposites, Kate. I have found, in my experience, that the bravest thing a person ever does is usually done, while they are more afraid than they have ever been in their life." He reached over and took her hand, and this time neither of them hesitated. Neither of them spoke of timing or propriety, or all the reasons it might not yet be the moment. He simply lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, gentle and reverent, and when he looked up at her, his gray eyes bright even in the dim light, she felt something in her chest crack open wide and warm. "I do not want to wait any longer to tell you plainly," he said. "I love you, Kate Bailey. I have loved you, I think, since the second week I worked in that back room and you fell asleep over the ledgers, and I did not have the heart to wake you, and I sat there and watched you sleep, and thought I had never in my life seen anyone so brave and so tired and so utterly worth staying for." Kate laughed, half a sob and half true joy, and leaned her head against his shoulder. "I love you too," she said. "I have loved you since you told me you noticed I was holding my breath. No one has looked at me that closely since my father died, Silas. No one has bothered to see me at all." He turned, tilted her chin up gently with 2 fingers, and kissed her then, soft and slow, the kind of kiss that carried inside it all the fear and relief and tenderness of the night behind them, and the promise of every night still to come. When they finally drew apart, the sky above Cedar Ridge had begun to lighten at the edges, streaks of pale gold breaking over the flat horizon, and somewhere down the street, a rooster crowed as though the whole world had simply decided, quietly, to keep going. The county bank examiner, a careful and unhurried man named Mr. Percival Adler, arrived on schedule the following week, and found waiting for him not the failing, fraud-riddled institution Elias Grimshaw had promised, but a complete and meticulously organized account of exactly how that fraud had been committed, signed by Otis Whitcomb, corroborated by the scarred hired man now sitting in the county jail, and backed by the Wichita money order receipts that traced a clear line from Grimshaw's discreet third-party boarding house straight back into the pages of Kate Bailey's ledgers. Grimshaw fought it, of course, with lawyers brought in from Wichita and blustering claims that he was the victim of a conspiracy cooked up by a desperate woman and a drifter with no reputation to lose. But the evidence was too complete, too carefully assembled, and too thoroughly corroborated by too many independent sources for any of it to hold. A judge, riding the circuit through Cedar Ridge that autumn, found Elias Grimshaw liable for fraud and conspiracy, stripped him of his license to operate the cattlemen's exchange, and ordered restitution paid to every rancher whose loan had been falsely inflated. Grimshaw, his reputation and his fortune both in ruin, sold what remained of his holdings within the year and left Cedar Ridge for good, taking his son Cornelius with him, and the town, for the most part, was glad to see the back of both of them. But it was what happened in the days between the examiner's arrival and the judge's ruling that mattered most to Kate Bailey and to Silas Townsend, because it was in those days, with the bank finally safe, and the truth finally out in the open air where everyone could see it, that Kate did something her father would never have imagined, and something the whole town would talk about for years afterward with a particular kind of fondness, reserved for stories that end exactly the way people wish more stories would end. She called Silas into the back office one evening, the same room where they had spent so many long nights over ledgers and lamplight, and she set in front of him a single sheet of paper, freshly drawn up by the same lawyer who had helped present the case against Grimshaw. "What is this?" Silas asked, though something in the careful way she watched him told him she wanted him to read it rather than simply be told. He read it slowly, and as he read his throat tightened, because the paper before him was a partnership deed, drawn in proper legal form, naming Silas Townsend as equal partner and co-owner of the Bailey Trust Bank of Cedar Ridge, effective immediately, his name printed there beside her father's in a place of permanent record. "Kate," he said, when he could finally speak, "I walked into this bank 3 months ago with nothing to my name. I do not have money to buy a share of anything." "You did not buy your way into anything," Kate said, echoing, without quite meaning to, the very words he had spoken to her that first morning. "You walked in with empty hands, Silas, and you gave this bank the only thing that has ever truly mattered in it, which is honesty and courage, and care for people who had no reason to expect either from a stranger. My father spent 11 years building something worth trusting, and you spent 3 months proving you were worthy of carrying that trust forward. I am not giving you this because I feel sorry for you or because I owe you a debt. I am giving it to you because it is true, and because I cannot imagine running this bank or this life without you standing beside me." Silas set the paper down carefully on the desk, as though it were something fragile, and reached for her hands instead. "There is only one way I would accept this, Kate, and it is not as a business partner alone." Kate's breath caught, and she watched as he lowered himself to one knee right there in the small back office, amid the ledgers and the lamplight and the faint smell of ink and dust that had somehow, over these past strange and difficult months, come to smell like home. "I do not have a ring to offer you," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "I do not have land or a herd or anything a man is supposed to have before he asks a question like this one. All I have is what I have always had since the day I walked through that door, which is my word and my hands, and whatever is left of my heart after everything it has been through. Kate Bailey, will you marry me, and let me spend the rest of my life proving that empty hands can still build something worth keeping?" Kate was laughing and crying both at once, the sound of it bright and unguarded in the quiet room. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Silas Townsend, 1,000 times yes." And she pulled him up by the collar of his shirt and kissed him before he had even fully risen from the floor, both of them laughing into the kiss, clumsy and joyful and entirely certain, for the first time in either of their long, hard lives, that they had finally found the place where they were meant to stay. They were married that October in the small white church at the edge of town, with nearly the whole of Cedar Ridge turning out to watch, because by then everyone knew the story, or some version of it, passed hand to hand across counters and porches, until it had taken on the shine of a proper legend. The drifter who walked into the bank with nothing and ended up saving it, the banker's daughter who had the courage to see past his empty pockets to the honest heart underneath, and the crooked man who had tried to take it all and lost everything instead. Ranchers who had nearly lost their land to Grimshaw's scheme came to shake Silas's hand before the ceremony, their gratitude plain and unashamed, and more than one weathered old cattleman found himself dabbing at his eyes when Kate walked down the aisle in her mother's altered wedding dress, her face lit with a joy that had been a long, long time coming. Otis Whitcomb, true to the promise made him, was spared prosecution in exchange for his testimony, though he resigned his position at the bank out of a shame he could not quite shake, and took up honest work instead as a clerk at the general store, where over time he became known as one of the more careful and trustworthy men in town, as though the whole ordeal had scoured something clean in him that had gone soft and careless before. He and his family stayed on in Cedar Ridge, and though Kate never fully forgot what he had done, she found in time that she could forgive it, understanding better than most the particular kind of fear that made ordinary men do things they later regretted bitterly. Deputy Harmon, who had happened along on his rounds at precisely the right moment, was given a small permanent raise in his town salary at Kate's insistence, on the grounds, as she put it with a smile, that a town ought to properly thank the men who kept it safe, even when they did not know at the time exactly how much was riding on their timing. The bank itself flourished in the years that followed, its reputation for honesty spreading beyond Cedar Ridge as word traveled along the cattle trails that Bailey and Townsend trust was a place where a rancher's word and a rancher's numbers would always be treated the same, fairly, and without hidden alteration. Silas brought to the counter a particular gift for making nervous first-time borrowers feel at ease, remembering, always, what it had felt like to stand in a doorway with nothing and ask, plainly, for a chance. And he made certain that no one who came through those doors honest and hopeful was ever turned away without being truly heard. Kate, for her part, grew into her role not merely as her father's successor, but as something entirely her own, a woman known throughout the county for her sharp eye and her fair hand, respected in rooms where a woman's voice had rarely before been given serious weight. They built a house together on a small piece of land at the edge of town, modest but sturdy, with a porch that faced west toward the very cattle trails Silas had once ridden in on, half-starved and hopeless, and in the evenings they would sit there together after the bank had closed, watching the sun go down gold and orange over the plains, talking over the day's business, or simply sitting in the easy, comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed words to feel close to one another. Their first child, a son, was born in the summer of 1879, a sturdy, dark-haired boy they named Thomas, after Kate's father, and Silas held him for the first time with the same careful, reverent steadiness he had once used to lift Kate's hand to his lips on the front step of the bank, tears standing openly in his eyes as he looked down at the small, furious, red face of his son and murmured, so quiet only Kate heard him, that he had never in his whole life imagined he would be given so much, starting from so little. 2 years later came a daughter, whom they named Sarah, after Silas's own mother, back in Georgia, whom he had not seen in over a decade but wrote to now regularly, sending photographs and news of the bank and eventually an invitation for her to come west and see her grandchildren, an invitation she accepted, arriving in Cedar Ridge in the spring of 1882 to find her son transformed from the grieving, homeless young man who had ridden away from Georgia after the war into a respected businessman, a devoted husband, and a father whose whole face changed shape with tenderness whenever his children ran to greet him. The town itself continued to grow around them, the railroad bringing more settlers, more cattle, more commerce, and through all of it the Bailey and Townsend Trust stood on the corner of Main and 2nd Street as it always had, its gold letters repainted fresh each spring, its doors open to anyone with an honest need and an honest hand, exactly as Thomas Bailey had first envisioned it, and exactly as his daughter and the drifter she had married had fought, at considerable risk, to preserve. On quiet evenings, sitting together on their porch with their children playing in the yard below, Kate would sometimes ask Silas to tell the story again, though she knew it every bit as well as he did, because there was a particular comfort in hearing it told aloud, in hearing him describe once more, the bell ringing thin and bright above the door, the hat he had held nervously in his hands, the 7 inked over the ghost of a 2. "Tell me again how it started," she would say, leaning her head against his shoulder as the sun sank low and gold over the plains. "I walked into a bank with nothing," Silas would answer, every time, his voice warm with the particular fondness of a man who had learned, the hard way, exactly how much a person could be given when they least expected it. "And I did not have a single dollar to my name, and no family in this town, and no reputation beyond the dust on my boots. But I had my word, and I had 2 working hands, and I had the good sense for once in my life to walk through the right door on the right morning. He would pause here always and press a kiss to the top of her head, and finish the way he always finished, the way that never once failed to make her smile no matter how many times she had heard it. And somehow Kate Bailey, by nothing more than grace and stubbornness and the best woman I have ever known, I walked out owning more than I ever thought a man like me was allowed to have. Not just a bank, a whole life, a whole family, you. And out on the porch, with their children's laughter drifting up from the yard and the last light of the Kansas evening settling soft and orange across the land, Kate Bailey Townsend would simply reach for her husband's hand, the same steady hand that had once held a Colt revolver level and calm in the dark of a threatened bank, the same hand that had once held nothing at all. And she would think, as she thought every evening at that particular hour, that she had never in her life been more certain of anything than she was certain of this. That some men walked into a room with empty hands and walked out having taken everything, and other men walked into a room with empty hands and walked out, having given everything instead, and that the second kind of man, the kind who built rather than took, the kind who saw a frightened, grieving woman behind a bank counter and gave her back her courage instead of stealing what little she had left, was the only kind of man worth loving for the whole of a lifetime. They lived long, full years together in Cedar Ridge, watching their son Thomas grow into a steady, careful young man who would himself one day take up the ledgers of the family bank, and their daughter Sarah grow into a sharp-tongued, quick-witted young woman who would marry a local school teacher and start a small school of her own for the children of ranch hands who could not otherwise afford an education, carrying forward in her own way the same instinct for fairness that had brought her parents together in the first place. Cedar Ridge itself grew from a rough cattle town into a proper Kansas city over the decades that followed, its dusty Main Street eventually paved, its wooden storefronts eventually replaced with brick and stone. But the bank on the corner of Main and 2nd remained, generation after generation, a place where a person's word still counted for something, where honesty was still, against all the harder lessons of that hard country, rewarded in the end. And every April, on the anniversary of the day Silas Townsend had first walked through that door with dust on his boots and nothing in his pockets, Kate would find some small way to remind him of it. A note left on his desk, a fresh sprig of prairie flowers set beside his coffee cup, a quiet word whispered as they lay together in the dark of their bedroom. And every year, without fail, he would take her hand and press it to his lips exactly as he had that first gray dawn on the bank's front step, and tell her, in a voice that never once lost its wonder no matter how many years passed between them, that he would walk through that door again 1,000 times over, empty-handed every single time, if it meant walking out, at the end of it, into a life built alongside her.